This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Ryan Gingeras, professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and author of several books, including most recently Eternal Dawn, Turkey in the Age of Ataturk, which we actually discussed on this show. It just so happens exactly 6 months ago today. Hello again, Ryan, and thanks so much for coming back for another chat.
It's always nice to talk to you, David. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. We are speaking on Tuesday, the 9th of June, one day after Turkey's energy minister, Fatih Dönmez, said in a television interview that Turkey had selected 7 blocks for exploratory drilling off the coast of Libya as a result of its maritime borders pact with the Tripoli-based Government of National Accord, or GNA. Dönmez said Turkey expected to begin drilling operations in these blocks within a few months, and this would be on top of several drilling operations Turkey has undertaken off the coast of Cyprus in the past year or so, all of which were denounced by the Republic of Cyprus, Greece, and the European Union. Ryan, you wrote an article last week for the website War on the Rocks examining Turkey's Mavi Vatan, or Blue Homeland approach, which is directly connected to these maritime claims, but also lays out broader ambitions. You argue in that piece that, quote, it signals a somewhat dramatic shift in doctrine within Turkish political and military circles. Please, if you could give us an introduction to this term, Blue Homeland, and a sense of what it means for Turkey's government today.
Well, I think first off, I think the policy is a pretty dramatic shift in the sense that it signals formally a much more aggressive, a much more maximalist approach towards maritime issues. It's not necessarily a politics that is altogether new. Depending on what element of Turkey's maritime domain you look, Turkey has long possessed a kind of, be it aggressive or somewhat more combative posture, especially vis-a-vis Greece. This is what I guess makes it much more interesting and sort of precedent-setting. Is that it's much more all-encompassing with respect to not simply the matter of drilling, which I think is certainly at the forefront of Turkish maritime concerns nowadays, but also with respect to issues of the islands and the Aegean. A much more active posture in the Black Sea, perhaps. So it's clearly also a matter of branding. It's very much on message in terms of Turkey's overall posture towards issues of its borders, defense, its national interests in Syria and Iraq. So it is something of a big paradigm shift, and certainly something that has attained a lot of international headlines.
Right. Speaking of that shift, Ahmet Davutoglu became Turkey's foreign minister in 2009, largely thanks to his focus on or prioritization on developing an Islam-influenced, quote, strategic depth across the region, which was meant to spur greater cooperation and trade. But as the Arab Spring began to collapse, particularly in Syria and in Egypt, so too did Davutoglu's vision, not to mention his status with Erdogan and the Erdogan government. Turkey at this time was said to have gone from, quote, 0 problems with neighbors to 0 friends. In your piece, you wrote that there was almost something of a vacuum in terms of a grand strategic vision for Turkey's foreign policy for several years after this, until Giri Deniz, a retired rear admiral for the Turkish Navy, began laying out his view in a series of columns for ultranationalist Aydınlık newspaper starting around mid-2016, I guess. He argued, you write, that historically Turkey has lacked an appreciation of its maritime traditions, and that defending the country's territorial waters, its vast blue homeland, is every bit as important as protecting Turkish soil. And as a little aside, I wanted to mention here that this surname, Giri Deniz, in Turkish, if I'm not wrong, it means something like surging sea, which is
Right.
incredibly apt, right? Anyway, but to get back to my point, what do you think? What about Giri Deniz's approach has proven so appealing to both Erdogan and to Turkey's military? I tend to look at it, this policy shift from Davutoglu to Giri Deniz, and think, well, Turkey no longer had any friends among neighboring states, so it instead turned to the one place where it might still gain some leverage, the high seas.
So I actually think there's a lot of connective tissue between strategic depth, Davutoglu's general worldview, and Jim Gurdeni's and his writings. I'm sure perhaps Jim Gurdeni's would probably take strong exception to that, but there is, if you read Strategic Depth, Davutoglu takes on issues of maritime security quite directly and rather expansively in the book. And where you definitely see it is with respect to a kind of rejectionist posture towards the possession of Greek islands in the Aegean, or at the very least a kind of dramatic renegotiation of Greek sovereignty in the Aegean, a pretty aggressive stance vis-a-vis Cyprus. When Strategic Depth was written, the issue of natural gas explorations wasn't quite on the horizon yet. But a lot of the basic precepts that go into this concept that Jim Gurdeniz innovates and touts with great regularity. I mean, there is a lot of continuity with respect to, from Strategic Depth to Mavi Vatan. Among them also is this sort of romanticization of Ottoman history, and the belief that Turkey has to recapture its prowess as a maritime power. And I think when you read Jim Gurdeniz's writings, and by the way, I mean, parenthetically, he's incredibly prolific, which in and of itself is quite striking, for the fact that we don't have many former flag officers, who is as outgoing in terms of media exposure and who is as expressive as him in terms of formulating a kind of grand strategic vision for Turkey's future. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, to get to sort of the point you were trying to make, I'm not necessarily sure that the breakdown of Davutoglu's own strategic vision for Turkey, has kind of bled into into this new concept, or this new construct that we see unfolding today. I actually think to some degree they are one is a continuation of another. And I think also I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if for whatever reason the individuals like Jim Gurdeniz, who are at least sort of informally somewhat allied, or have been somewhat allied with the government, or at least with factions that are closer to Erdogan. I wouldn't be surprised if he becomes more directly politically marginalized in the same way Davutoglu has. I don't think his personality is sort of as important as elements of these ideologies. I think are still somewhat in favor, in Erdogan's court, even though the individuals may move on, even though elements of those worldviews may be, somewhat overtaken by events. So, I think, what we're seeing today is still a kind of, fluid process by which the government is trying to put forward, a maximalist stance within the maritime domain, and using this sort of strategic vision, or this label Mavi Vatan, to make this claim and legitimize its claim.
You mentioned how much of a presence Giri Deniz has been on Turkish media. That wasn't always the case. From 2009, let me just kind of trace his story a little bit. From 2009 to 2011, the early sort of glory years of Davutoglu's run as foreign minister, Giri Deniz held a top position running the Turkish Navy's policy planning division. Right. Then he was arrested as part of the military coup plot trial known as Sledgehammer, which was key to the Erdogan government's effort to end military tutelage in Turkey. Giri Deniz was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison, but was released in 2015. Then, following the failed coup a year later, Giri Deniz finally emerged as a consistent nationalist and anti-Western voice in Turkish media, just as the government began promoting this kind of Vatan Party loyalists within military circles. I wonder what you think about Giri Deniz's journey, going from in to out to back in again in a span of 5 years, and what it tells us about Turkish politics.
It's a really great question. And, I have to say that whatever I'm about to say is largely based on speculation. And I think what a person should definitely have in mind here is that when it comes to the partisanship associated with the military, whether you're talking about, active duty or retired personnel, there seems to be always a little bit of a kabuki dance in terms of what their political leanings are and all of that. I mean, I think, it's long been said that the military is something of a black box. And, so I don't know how much, with what kind of confidence, we can sort of say, for example, that Jim Gordon is a member of the Vatan Party, or, holds, a kind of as orthodox views as somebody like Doğu Perinçek, the head of the Vatan Party. Now, having said that, I mean, I think, one thing that, Jim Gordon's rise to media prominence tells us is that, or has helped reveal, is that there are actually a lot of, several, I don't know about a lot, but maybe there are several noted former flag officers from the Turkish Navy who are, or who were, aligned in some way with the Vatan Party. And I think that in and of itself is somewhat interesting and revealing. Now, does that mean that the Vatan Party possesses a specific or particular following within the Navy? If so, to what degree is that historical? To what degree is that recent? It's hard to say. At the same time, I think that his arrest and then his rehabilitation post 2013-14 is something that is reflected in the lives of lots of former military officers, particularly flag officers, and that those experiences deeply imprint upon them. When you read their writings, it definitely helps shape their worldview, particularly their enmity towards not simply Gulenis, but also towards the United States. And that, it's very common to read interviews of former flag officers who essentially blame the United States for the Sledgehammer trials, and saying that essentially it was as much of an American plot as it was a Gulenis plot. That's the second thing that I think we learn. And I think another thing that we learn in looking at his life story is that the officers who are particularly strongly associated with Mavi Vatan, or at least as a concept, as promoters or people who have embodied that this new strategic vision, these are people who have a very, strong historical connections to the United States as flag officers. Many of them have, let's say, worked in NATO, or had been, had been parts of operations associated with NATO, or worked at NATO headquarters. Many of them were educated in the United States, particularly at a postgraduate level, and are actually quite, familiar with American policy as well as American, naval culture. And so I think it's somewhat revealing that these individuals, who have taken on this, this concept, often do so with an express desire to counter what they believe is, as Giri Deniz often puts it, American imperialism. Now I'll start over. I think what we see with someone like Giri Deniz, and we see this in other publicly vocal former flag officers, is how staunchly antagonistic they are towards the United States, specifically what they term American imperialism, and American as well as the the Greek and other American allies, their own postures within the Eastern Mediterranean. So all in all, I think what we do get a general sense of through the emergence of this concept is a strong internal sense of at least the experiences, the worldview, the political orientation of a pretty significant number of former flag officers who are at least having some degree of influence over the development of Turkish policy in the Eastern Mediterranean.
And would you say that trickles down to active officers?
Hard to say. I mean, again, this is particularly somewhat of a dicey proposition, since regular flag officers are noticeably rather quiet when it comes to the media. And this would probably lead into a topic that I'm sure you'd want to discuss, which is the topic of jihad yaycı,
we'll get to that in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. Let me ask you something first about what you were just talking about. As you mentioned, among Giri Deniz's more prominent ideas is that the role of Gülenists in the failed coup masked what he describes as what he calls the Atlantic Front, which was a Western conspiracy against Erdogan and his shift potentially toward Russia. In his weekly columns, Giri Deniz would often accuse the U.S. of working to stop Turkey's rise as a global power. Much of this aligns with Erdogan's regular anti-Western rhetoric, but that's often just rhetoric, right? I mean, look at the news today. Erdogan just spoke to Trump on the phone and said afterward that the two reached agreements that would spark a new era in Libya. So I wonder, to what extent do you think Giri Deniz's views have taken root at the top levels of Erdogan's government? Would one be right to assume that Turkey's embrace of Blue Homeland means Ankara also embraces his conspiracy theories, or his suggestion that Turkey should build deeper ties with Russia and with China?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen this sort of, radical shift in rhetoric before, from, deeply antagonistic to announcements of, the beginnings of a new kind of partnership with the United States. We've seen this kind of shift before from Erdogan. And I think, the way I see it now is that Erdogan may very well ditch the concept of Mavi Vatan in name, but maybe not in spirit. I think that the kind of conspiratorial worldview that someone like Giri Deniz holds in a very kind of seemingly profound and orthodox way. I think that I can't tell you exactly what Erdogan necessarily believes in his heart of hearts, but he's certainly capable of wheeling out those kinds of conspiracies and then sort of tucking them away depending on, on the context. I think the difference between Giri Deniz and Erdogan is Giri Deniz has staked a great deal more than simply, his sort of intellectual reputation on this worldview. This is profoundly, a representative of who he is and how he, sees the world around him. Where Erdogan, I think, can be a little bit more promiscuous.
Mm-hmm. Another crucial element of Giri Deniz's vision, which you mentioned before, is that Greece is seen as deeply problematic, often aligned with this Atlantic front I mentioned, which means Turkey must deal firmly with Athens, and it has, in terms of islands in the Aegean and Mediterranean, in regards to Cyprus and oil and gas drilling, even along the land border earlier this year when it was overrun with refugees looking to cross from Turkey to Greece. Last weekend, Athens attacked Turkey's plan to drill off the coast of Libya as a, quote, new provocation. I just wonder, do you think Greek-Turkish relations are as tense today as they've been in decades? And if so, I guess we might blame Giri Deniz and Blue Homeland as much as Erdogan.
I mean, I don't know. I think, the charting the depths of Turkish and Greek relations is always somewhat tricky because how bad it actually is compared to how it ever was. Yeah, it's sort of, it's a little challenging. It's certainly not quite the depths of, let's say, 1974, when the two countries almost went to war, or the late 1990s.
Turkey invaded Cyprus. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, or, in the late 1990s when, there was the threat of war over islands in the Aegean. It's certainly quite bad. I guess the real question is, beyond rhetoric, what can Greece do to halt this? And I think that, these kinds of assertions in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly those that are closer to the island of Crete, which is where some of this drilling could potentially take place. This definitely is a far more an even more aggressive kind of stroke than anything we've seen in recent years. But I think one has to also consider that the issue goes beyond simply gas drilling. Turkish warplanes, regularly violate, Greek airspace. There are regular, confrontations between Greek and Turkish airplanes in the Aegean. And then obviously, you add the issue of of refugees. There's just a lot on the table when it comes to the relationship between these two states, but it's clear that Turkey is quite confident that it can be this aggressive, knowing that it's not going to necessarily pay any direct costs. And so far, Ankara has turned out to be right in that estimation.
As you point out in your article, the Turkish Navy's 2015 Outlook document made no mention of Blue Homeland. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, and Turkey's Navy is undertaking its largest ever exercises, which were dubbed Blue Homeland. Defense Minister Hulusi Akar is mentioning it in his Victory Day address, and Erdogan delivers a speech in front of a big Blue Homeland map. You write in your piece that the greatest achievement of the Blue Homeland worldview might be Turkey's maritime borders pact with Libya's GNA, which I mentioned before. It has been widely praised in Turkey and widely denounced on the international stage. Why do you see this deal, this memorandum, as maybe Blue Homeland's finest moment?
Well, I think it is the most concrete expression of this agenda, in terms of staking a claim to an expansive exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, in the Mediterranean, and clearly, Ankara is using this agreement as the thing that will validate it validate their exploratory efforts in matters of law. Now, I mean, obviously, it's something of a fig leaf since it's contested. It's contested by Greece, and the fact that Turkey is not a signatory to international maritime law, law of the sea. So clearly, this kind of arrangement that Turkey has now reached with the GNA government of Libya is the closest thing that they have to a de facto achievement underneath this, underneath the auspices of this, of this framework. Now, I mean, it should be pointed out that I think it is possible that this is a kind of early posturing in Turkey's, outlook or approach towards the issues of energy in the Eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps they think that in staking this kind of, really expansive claim to the seafloor, they will eventually get pushback. They will eventually have to negotiate, with perhaps the EU or, or perhaps with Greece. And maybe they don't attain the full extent of their rights, but having staked such an early claim, anything that they cede, in terms of their overall sort of territorial interest would still be a win. It would still count as a win. So I mean, I say this more as a note of caution that we shouldn't. It still appears that there are plenty of off ramps before Turkey fully goes through with its exploratory efforts. But already it's, states have taken notice and they don't necessarily see this as a completely empty act.
The architect of this Turkey-Libya maritime borders deal was Navy Chief of Staff Cihat Yaycı, who you mentioned before. Sorry to interrupt you on that. He received considerable praise for the deal, but then suddenly last month was demoted and resigned. Several reasons were put forward in pro-government media for Yaycı's demotion, as you mentioned in your article, including the idea that he was a rising star feared by Defense Minister Akar. But you also say in your article that what might be more important is that Giri Deniz saw the demotion as backed by the Atlantic Front and expressed his hope that the state would continue to embrace Yaycı's ideas. He then left Aydınlık newspaper, which is associated with, as we mentioned, this ultra-nationalist Vatan Party. I wonder how you interpreted all this. Could it be that we're already seeing the decline of Blue Homeland just as it seemed to be peaking?
Well, again, we can only speculate, and I think that it could be looked at perhaps as an expression of Erdogan's desire to maybe dial back some degree of the policy, or at least the ways in which certain advocates of the policy foresee it. It's probably much more likely that this represents a power struggle within the Turkish armed forces and the relationship between the armed forces and the president. Now, I think I think the first thing that one should keep in mind is that the Navy within the Turkish armed forces is long been kind of seen as a second tier element of the armed forces. The first element being the land forces, garnering the lion's share of the budget, lion's share of the attention. And then the Air Force, which has attained ever greater amounts of attention, particularly on the back of the drone, the expansion and improvement of Turkey's drone capability. And so you have to consider that, there is some degree of competition between the various branches. And, among the things that, Giri Deniz himself often, states within his writings, is that in crafting this concept of the Blue Homeland, among his objectives is to raise people's consciousness of Turkey's maritime interests and the importance of the Navy. And so Cihat Yaycı perhaps is the most, he's arguably the most celebrated, or at least was most celebrated flag officer from the Navy within Turkish politics within recent memory. I don't think if you were to ask somebody, 5 or 10 years ago, name a member of the Turkish Navy's, staff, I don't think anybody would have been able to, unless they're deeply, deeply familiar with the armed forces.
So, and then does it seems likely then that may have played a role in his demotion? And
absolutely. And but also this, this his his demotion, and it's characterized as a demotion. Essentially, he was withdrawn as chief of staff, and he was going to be reassigned to the general staff in Ankara. This appointment, comes against the backdrop of other pretty noteworthy moves made by the promotions and assignments board within the Turkish armed forces. And what's often interpreted is that, certain promotions and certain forced retirements or reassignments are largely the product of Hulusi Akar, defense minister's own personal preferences and his desire to create a kind of cadre of senior officers who are much more dependent upon him, garner less political attention. So, here, in the case of Yayaci, somebody who's been name-checked by Erdogan within speeches, somebody who has been singularly associated with, Mavi Vatan policies over the last, 9 to 12 months. So, one could interpret this as, again, this kind of strange power struggle, between Akar and elements of the armed forces, perhaps between Akar and Erdogan himself. Now, I think, in terms of, the reasonings that have been, proffered regarding Yayaci's, promotion, or reassignment and then his resignation from the Navy, is that this is, been yet another Gulenist plot or something that was demanded of Turkey by the United States. And this should be added. This is something that has, that Yayaci himself has seemingly supported, that this was that he was accused of playing an inappropriate role in some sort of acquisitions deal within the Navy, and that this excuse was something that was made by some sort of contractor or business entity associated with the Gulenists. I don't know what to make of this claim in terms of how genuine it is, but I think the truth of the matter is it leaves people like Giri Deniz and Yayaci and others who are very secular, ultranationalists, people who are not traditional supporters of Erdogan or the AKP. Yayaci's reassignment, begs an obvious question of what does Erdogan want, and where does that leave this cadre of former officers with respect to the Mavi Vatan. And so you can't lay this on the doorstep of Erdogan. It sort of lays it. It's much safer to say that this is somehow yet again an extension of a long-standing plot.
You write in the article, that Erdogan does maintain at least some commitment to this blue homeland. Let's say Turkey continues to embrace blue homeland, continues to be aggressive and provocative in the Eastern Mediterranean. This, to me, seems certain to continue to increase tensions in the region. NATO has been frustrated with Turkey for years, largely because of its S-400 deal with Russia. Last month, we saw Greece, Cyprus, France, Egypt, and the UAE, a strange collection of states, issue this joint statement denouncing Ankara, which is a sign that these Turkish aggressions are already creating new alliances to oppose Turkey. It makes one wonder what might be the result of even more blue homeland-driven aggressions. Reading some of Giri Deniz's recent columns, I see there's a clear pattern. Turkey takes some aggressive maritime action, then Cyprus, Greece, the U.S., EU, or NATO denounce the move. Then Giri Deniz points to this response as a clear sign of Western aggression, spurring more Turkish animosity. In some ways, to me, it seems like a vision destined to lead Turkey to the brink of war, if not beyond.
Again, I mean, I think, as a note of caution, I don't know if I would take, the columns of Giri Deniz totally at face value, at least not at this stage. I mean, it's certainly true that, Turkey has behaved much more aggressively or provocatively, and has shown a willingness to put military force behind its interests. And we see this especially within Libya. Now, I think, on the other hand, the materialization of these sorts of alliances haven't yet really proved that effective. And it hasn't been as responsive as, one would otherwise think or expect. I mean, I think that while there's certainly a lot of talk going on between, say, Greece and Egypt and Israel, and the United States has also raised a certain amount of alarm towards Turkey's behavior, as has the EU. There's not really been any clear muscle behind this, and I think another element of this of these calculations isn't, I think, the fact that the Turkish Navy, comparatively speaking, is as capable or more capable than many other regional powers. And so there is some degree of calculation there that a state like Greece, would not necessarily match up very well against Turkey on the high seas. Having said all that, I think I wouldn't discount the idea that somehow political events may turn in which there is not so much the threat of war as this is the pretext for negotiation, and that Turkey can be somewhat confident in that it has already staked out a pretty a pretty extreme position, from which it can perhaps back down somewhat, but has already proven itself pretty willing to to call the bluff of various states in the region, as well as major powers such as Russia, the United States, and the European Union. And like I said, I mean, so far, there hasn't been much pushback. So it's been a relatively successful strategy so far.
I wonder if you think it's one of the main successes of Blue Homeland that the Turkish Navy, as you mentioned a couple times, maybe now has, both domestically and internationally, a bit more status, a bit more respect and stature.
I think that's certainly true. I guess the question of how Turkey as a maritime power fits within Turkey's larger ambitions as a state, whether as a regional power or even as a global power. I mean, it's fair to guess that the Navy's future is looking bright. We're not just talking about matters of policy. Turkey's efforts at recapitalization have been pretty ambitious, and so far, it points to the Navy's growth as a force that is much more advanced, much more capable than at any point in its recent history, and certainly much more advanced and more capable than many of Turkey's regional rivals. So I think that this shows the degree to which, on the basis of relatively little investment, with relatively little pain, Turkey has actually gained a rather great deal of credibility as a power and as a state in the region.
I was saying we can probably then expect it to continue to show assertiveness in the Eastern Mediterranean as well as in the Black Sea, which it has started to do more recently.
Yeah, although the Black Sea is a little bit different. I think, Black Sea is much more of it's a domain in which Turkey, faces Russia, not indirectly, but, directly across its shores. And here, the blue homeland posturing is, not necessarily as aggressive or combative. Very recently, there were reports that Turkey will also be sending drilling ships into the region. But this has been, Turkey's naval activities in these regions are much more modest and have very much gone out of their way to be somewhat conciliatory towards Russia.
Mm-hmm. Ryan Gingeras, professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. Thanks so much for talking to us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.